Hey, listen, here recently, Hannah and I have found this, I don't know what you want to call it, this affection, if you will, with movies about warfare. I don't know why war is so intriguing to me. And I don't just mean war like the death and the violence, but really the strategy that goes behind war, right? Like when you think about all the different wars in human history and the different strategies and approaches and the way that generals lead their armies, it's so fascinating to me, right? I think about like the trench warfare of World War I. If you've ever seen a movie like that, it was just an awful kind of warfare. So many people lost their lives. You have World War II, which kind of implements more of the surprise and the deception aspect into warfare. Or you can go way back in history. You can look at like the Civil War, where warfare was just line war, where people just stood in lines and shot each other. And it was like, you're not defending yourself at all. You're crazy. And you can even go back and look at the Revolutionary War and guerrilla warfare, all these different kinds of strategies. And what I love to look at in wars is the defense. Like, how are people protecting themselves in war? And one of my favorite ways, or one of my favorite things that we see in history and warfare, is the way that the Romans defended themselves in war. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but it's called the Roman tortoise, or the testudo. It's an amazing demonstration of bravery and courage and strategy. The Roman soldiers carried with them these large shields, and they would march into battle with them. And when the enemy attacked, a lot of times it was when an arrow was shot, they would take these shields and they would form this formation where the shield was on all sides and over the top of them, and they would all be protected. It was like a turtle retreating into its shell. And then that army could then march forward into enemy lines and then begin attacking. And it's an amazing display of defense. It shows that they were protected, that they could be delivered from the enemy's attacks. And there was this promise of safety in the Roman tortoise. Well, I think what we find in Proverbs chapter 2 is a defense that is similar to the Roman tortoise. Meaning that Proverbs 2 tells us how we can find protection, deliverance, and a promise. Just like the Romans found protection in their defense formation, Proverbs chapter 2 tells us that wisdom will protect us, will deliver us, and will promise us something. I want to show you this in Proverbs chapter 2. We'll continue our series on Proverbs as Solomon teaches us the way of wisdom. This morning, I want you to see that wisdom is not just a path and a person that we saw in chapter 1, but in chapter 2, we see that wisdom is a defense against evil. It's a defense against evil. I want you to look with me at verse number 6. We'll read from verse 6 to the end of the chapter. Hear the words of Solomon writing to his son. He says this: "For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice and watching over the way of his saints. Then you will understand righteousness and justice and equity, every good path, for wisdom will come into your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will watch over you, understanding will guard you, delivering you from the way of evil, from men of perverted speech, who forsake the paths of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness, who rejoice in doing evil and delight in the perverseness of evil, men whose paths are crooked and who are devious in their ways. So you will be delivered from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. For her house sinks down to death and her paths to the departed. None who go to her come back, nor do they regain the paths of life. So you will walk in the way of the good and keep to the paths of the righteous, for the upright will inhabit the land and those with integrity will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be rooted out of it. I want to show you three things this morning on how wisdom is a defense against evil. Notice with me first, I want you to see this in verses 6, 7, and 8, that God-given wisdom protects. God-given wisdom protects. Solomon teaches us, starting in verse 6, that wisdom will protect us. And before he can teach us that, he has to remind us in verse 6 that wisdom first begins with the Lord. Look what he says. He says it's the Lord. Notice all caps. It's Yahweh. It is the personal God of Israel who gives wisdom. Now I love this. Solomon is known as the wisest king to ever walk the earth. He is the wisest king of Israel, and yet he is quick to tell us that his wisdom is not his own. Wisdom comes from the Lord. Listen, wisdom is like a river flowing to your heart and your mind, but its origin begins with the Lord. It comes from God. And this reveals to us that Solomon understood that in order to grasp wisdom, you have to trust in the Lord. You have to have humility to say, God, I need help, right? Isn't this what the fear of the Lord is that we talked about in chapter 1, verse 7? So wisdom begins with God, but look what Solomon says in verse 7. He says that wisdom will come from God and he'll give us this wisdom. He's storing it up for the upright and for those who find wisdom, those who trust in God's wisdom. The result of that is that God will be a shield to them. You see this in verse 7. The essence here of this truth is not that wisdom rewards you with protection, but rather that the consequence of trusting in wisdom is protection. And the idea here is that God will give you protection because wisdom gives us the discernment to see good and bad, evil and wrong from what is good and what God loves. Like Solomon is teaching us here, if you want protection from the evil things in this world, you need to pursue wisdom. Pursue the fear of the Lord. I love this idea of the shield, that God's going to be a shield around us, protecting us. As we enter into trusting and wisdom, what we learn is that our best defense from evil is actually God. Like you, hear this, you are incapable of defending yourself from evil. Wisdom leads us into this reality that our best defense is from God. It also leads us into the reality that we're incapable of defending ourselves, and so we must trust in the Lord. Verse 8, we see how God will protect us. It says that he will guard the paths of justice and watch over the way of his saints. I love this idea of him guarding the path. The path of justice, just hear this, the path of justice is the path of obedience. Okay? When it says he's gonna guard the path of justice, that's the road that God wants us to walk on in obedience. It's the way of goodness, of what's right in the world, what's holy in the world, okay? And it's saying that God will guard that kind of road. Now listen, I'm gonna be honest. I think we can all agree that while we struggle to walk on this road, we are trying to, right? We want to obey the Lord. But why is it so difficult? Have you ever noticed that in your life, when you start obeying God, things get harder? Like when you start trying to obey God's commands, walking on the path of justice, all of a sudden, things get a lot harder. And if you've experienced that, your natural tendency is to say, oh, I'm just gonna retract from this. Like I'll just dip my toe in obedience. Like I will just barely obey, keep God happy, but I'm not gonna walk down the path any farther. It's too hard. Like all of the attacks of the enemy are coming at me. Like hear this, I get it. Satan hates it when you obey God. It feels like the attacks are not just coming on the left and the right, but like from the front and the back and like inside, like all around you. And you're like, how will I ever escape? But Proverbs chapter 2 is teaching us that when this happens, if we're trusting in the Lord and his wisdom, he will guard us. He will be a shield around us. You see, your fear of walking down the path of justice, the path of obedience, is actually a lack of faith in your God to protect you. Your fear of walking down the path is actually a lapse in your faith. And Proverbs 2 is telling us he'll guard the path. He'll keep you safe. He will protect you. Like, the imagery here is that God is standing on all sides of you, waiting for the attack, and he's protecting. Not only this, he's not just guarding the path, but look at the end of verse 8. He's watching over the way of his saints. Right? It's not just that God is all around you and walking with you, which isn't there great comfort that God's walking with you in that path? He's not saying, hey, I'll send someone else to be a shield. He says, I'm the shield. He's with you. But not just that, he's not just with you, but it's the idea that he's over top of you. Like God is an eagle soaring over you, looking ahead to see what other attacks are coming. Looking far to the left, far to the right. He's anticipating how is Satan going to attack you, and he's watching over you. Like, hear this, your God cares for you. Man, if you just don't see anything else, see this, that God loves you. He protects you. And it comes from when we trust in wisdom and trust in the Lord. You know, the New Testament agrees with this principle. Consider with what the Apostle Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 6 about the armor of God. Remember that one thing that Paul tells us to pick up and to do so in faith? It's called the shield of faith, right? And what is the shield of faith to protect us from? From the fiery darts of the enemy. That seems to be the imagery here of Proverbs chapter 2. And it's not by coincidence that the shield that will protect us is trusting in the Lord. It's faith that protects you. Faith that he will guard you. He will watch over you. Like, God cares for you and loves you. You know, in the human life, we always consider protection to be an expression of love. Now think about this. A soldier that protects his country deeply cares and loves for his country. Would you agree with that? Like, a husband that protects his wife cares and loves his wife. A mom that protects her children deeply cares and loves her children. A friend that protects another friend is a good friend that loves well. If this is true of these relationships, how much more does your God in heaven love you? He's not just protecting you. He knows how dumb you are and that you'll continue to walk into danger. And he still says, I'll guard you, I'll watch over you. Like, how much more love does he have for us? We're the kind of people that constantly walk in the face of danger. We constantly walk out in front of the car without looking both ways. And God says, I'll guard you, I'll protect you, I'll care for you, I'll love you anyways. I'll step in front of the car and push you out of the way time and time again. He is a shield about you and a guard on your path. Solomon teaches us that wisdom, God-given wisdom, the kind of wisdom that trusts in the Lord, is the kind of wisdom that will protect you from the evil of this life. Notice secondly with me in verses 9 through 19 that God-given wisdom, it doesn't just protect you, but it delivers you. Hear this, it delivers you. You see, once God has proven himself as a protector, now the son is to pursue wisdom in a different way. Solomon is saying that, like, the benefit of God as protector will then lead you into wisdom. Look what he says in verse number 9. Then you will understand. Catch this. It's after you've trusted in God, faith in God, he's protected you. Now you have knowledge of wisdom in a different way because you've seen God be faithful. Then, verse 9, you'll understand righteousness and justice and equity, every good path. Don't miss this. Verse number 9, you'll understand, that's the mind. Verse 10, wisdom will come into your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. The mind, the heart, and the soul are all present here. It's this idea of completeness, that God is changing you completely to love wisdom and to trust wisdom. Not just part of you. Hey, God doesn't want just part of you. He wants all of you. The crazy truth here is that if you pursue wisdom, God will protect you from evil. And in his protection, you'll grow in wisdom even more, and you'll have the discernment to protect yourself. Not that you don't need God anymore, but he gives you the discernment. Look at this. I want to show you this in verse number 9. This last word in verse number 9, every good path, the Hebrew word for path, literally there is wagon tracks. Like the cart tracks, like the ruts that a wheel on a wagon makes. The idea is that after the rain, like when God's still leading you in the rain and it's muddy and it leaves the track so you can follow the path, long after the rain's gone and you feel like you're all alone and it's dry, you can still see the way to go because the tracks are still there. Like he's saying, you'll grow in wisdom so that you can continue to trust in the Lord and walk with him. Now jump down to verse 11 and 12 with me. See how wisdom will deliver us from evil. He says discretion will watch over you, understanding. He's mentioning these aspects of wisdom. And in verse 12, he says, you'll be delivered from the way of evil. The difference here is incredible to me. Like protection, what God does in verses 6 through 8 is the idea of safety while remaining still, right? Protection is this idea of I'm protected inside of a house, but deliverance demands movement. You hear this? Protection is in the presence of evil. Deliverance is freedom from the presence of evil. This is good. Look at verse 12. Solomon tells us what this kind of evil looks like. He says it's the way of evil. It's men with perverted speech. Hey, let me just break this down for a second. Perverted speech here. What is Solomon talking about? He's talking about the kind of people who take things that are wrong, morally, ethically wrong, according to God's standard, and they call it right. Perversion is when you take something that's bad and you claim it as good. They're the kind of men who say, hey, this is actually good. I know it feels wrong. I know that God says it's wrong, but it's actually good. They're perverted speech. Not only that, they forsake the paths of uprightness. They walk in the ways of darkness. They rejoice in evil doing. They delight in the perverseness of evil. Their paths are crooked and they're devious in their ways. I think Solomon has in mind the gang of sinners of chapter 1, right? Remember these guys? They perverted speech to cloak evil of murder as financial gain, to make it look like it was a good thing. Hey, let's go murder this guy and take all of his stuff. They perverted goodness. They forsook uprightness by seeking to murder. They were walking in darkness and wanting to take what's not theirs. They rejoiced in evil because it was going to give them financial gain. They delighted in perverseness as they were going to take the life of another man. Their paths were crooked, their ethics were twisted, their ways were wrong, and they were devious. Literally, they were just like the serpent in the garden, sly, cunning, and deceitful. I don't know about you, but I just can't help but think that this is a perfect description of our culture. Like our culture is a perverted speech kind of culture. It's forsaken righteousness. It's walking in darkness. Our culture rejoices in evil. The paths are not straight. It's divisive and cunning, devious, deceitful. And like we too with the son, I can only imagine Solomon's son hearing this and he's like, Dad, I need deliverance from this. Like this sounds awful. You ever feel that way? God, just take me home. This place is so wicked. I'm tired of the hurt and the pain. You ever felt that? Like we too, we need deliverance from this. Solomon doesn't end there though. He keeps going. Look at verse 16. He says, you'll not only be delivered from that kind of evil, but you'll also be delivered from this kind of evil, the evil of the forbidden woman. Now, the forbidden woman is going to come up all throughout Proverbs, and the word forbidden there in the ESV is extremely important, right? The word can also be translated as strange or outsider or foreigner. And with that, we get a clear understanding of what Solomon means. This is the foreign lady. The idea here is not that the woman is just another race or culture, but that she comes from a different ethic. Let me explain this. You know how in the Old Testament, God tells Israel, hey, don't marry with the other nations, but marry inside of Israel, right? This was not a cultural issue or a racial issue. It's not that God is a racist. That's not what he's saying. No. This is the beginning of the principle that you cannot be unequally yoked. You heard this? When you date, when you marry, you don't want to be unequally yoked. You want someone whose ethic, their morality is the same as yours. And this is what God was telling us in the Old Testament. And what Solomon is saying is that even the woman who has the different ethic, the different morality, she's going to try to tempt you into darkness. You'll be delivered from her as well. Look what he says in verse 16 about the woman. She's an adulteress. We learn that the reason she's dangerous is because she delights in sexual immorality. She delights in sexual sin. She wants to tempt the son. She wants to sway him into darkness. Look what it says about her. She's not just an adulteress. She has smooth words. Her words, they're easy on the ears. One commentator said that for men, the smooth words of adultery start with the blowing up of an ego. It's the kind of words that make you feel good, let you put your guard down. You stop thinking with discernment. Look what it says in verse 17 about her. She forsakes the companion of her youth. It's this idea that she's left her spouse. She doesn't care that she's been married before. She's forgotten the covenant. That's the marriage in verse 17. She's forgotten the covenant she made with God. And look what it says about her house. It sinks down to death. To follow her into her home is to walk into death. Her paths go to the departed, to those who are dead. Verse 19, and none who go to her come back. Hey, hear this. Solomon's trying to give us a warning, and he's going to tell us this again and again in Proverbs, but I'm just going to kind of glimpse it to you right here. He's telling us that sexual sin is a slippery slope that always leads to death. Did you hear that? Sexual sin, sexual immorality. I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's the form of a mental fantasy or internet searches or lustful eyes or inappropriate actions before marriage or even the kinds of conversations that should only happen in marriage that you are partaking in. It's a slippery slope that leads to death. The forbidden woman, her words sound good, promise lots, and give you only death. But the promise here of this passage is back in verse 16, that trusting in wisdom gives you deliverance from this kind of woman. If you're suffering with this kind of sin, Proverbs 2:16 is saying you can find freedom. Not just protection in the presence of it, but deliverance out of it. This is what wisdom promises. God-given wisdom, it protects us and it delivers us from evil. And Solomon's point is all kinds of evil. Doesn't matter what it is. Let me show you this final thing in this passage, verses 20 through 22. God's God-given wisdom protects us, it delivers us. But see finally that it promises us something. There's a promise that comes with it. Solomon's final words to his son, they promise that wisdom will lead to a life of success and vitality. It will culminate in this dwelling place only for the righteous, that the wicked will not be allowed there. There's a question here in these verses. The question is simply, are we going to walk in the crooked paths? of the sinners, or are we going to walk in the straight path of justice where God calls us to? He promises to his son in verse 21 that it'll be the upright, those who walk with wisdom, who trust in wisdom. It will be those kinds of people who will inhabit the land. By the way, this imagery of land is a picture of the promised land that God gave to Israel, right? A place where there's no idolatry, no sin, and it's God dwelling with his people. Like, this is a good place to go to. Look what it says in verse 22. The wicked will be cut off. They won't be allowed. The treacherous will be rooted out. It's the idea that they're pulled out of the land. Like, hear this. Verses 20, 21, and 22 tell us that wisdom promises heaven. That's what this is. The land without the wicked is heaven. The land without sin or death or temptation, this is heaven. Like, it looks just like Revelation 21 when God wipes the tears from our eyes. It's a place with no darkness, no perverse speech, no deceit, no lying, no adultery, no sexual immorality, no death. It's a perfect place for God's people. There's only one problem in this passage. The promise of heaven in Proverbs 2 is for the upright and those with integrity. Look what it says in verse 21. Who inhabits the land? The upright. Who is it that will remain in the land? Those with integrity. And if we're honest with ourselves, we are not men and women of uprightness and integrity. We look way too much like verses 12 through 15. We are the ones with the perverted speech. We're not the saints or the holy ones that have been mentioned. We're not the one who walk in the way of good. We don't keep to the path of righteousness. Like, we are evil. We're perverted in our speech. You say, I'm not that perverted in my speech. When was the last time you tried to justify your sin? A couple hours ago? Last night? You say, well, I didn't do that. Well, what about this? Did you forsake the path of uprightness and walk in darkness? Like, did you let your eyes linger onto something you weren't supposed to? Did you have a thought in your mind towards someone? Like, we delight in evil. The reality is that we are not the ones who are promised heaven in Proverbs chapter 2. It's promised for those who trust in God fully every single time. And while we failed in this area, there was a son who came from Solomon's line who never failed in this. And his name is Jesus. You see, Jesus lived to this perfectly, not because he tried harder than you, not because he was working harder than you. No. He was able to do this because he was the Son of God from heaven. He's the perfect son of Proverbs 2. He is the upright one. He's the one with integrity. He's the holy one who walks down the path of righteousness. But listen, this is what Jesus has done as the perfect son. He's made a way for you and me. So that through his blood, through his sacrifice, now we can be called upright. We can be called righteous. We can be called holy. Like, hear this, the only way you find the promise of wisdom of a land that's cut off from the wicked is through Jesus. Only through his name. Like, only Jesus will you find protection in your fight from sin. Only through Jesus will you find deliverance from the forbidden woman. Only through Jesus will you find the promise of heaven. Jesus is the perfect son of Proverbs 2 who listens to his father. But the reason he's able to do this is because he is wisdom himself. You say, what do you mean, Tanner? Well, listen to what 1 Corinthians 1 says about Jesus. And because of him, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption, so that as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. Like, this text shows us that Jesus is the essence of God's wisdom. When you look at Jesus, when you trust in Jesus, you trust in wisdom. You say, how can I know that I can trust in Jesus? How can I know that Jesus will accept me? Like, I've done some really bad things in my life. Well, just return back to me to Proverbs 2. Let me show you verse 4. This is how Solomon starts this chapter. He's telling his son to treasure wisdom, to listen to wisdom. And in verse 3, he says, if you call out for insight, if you raise your voice for understanding. Verse 4, if you seek it like silver and search for it as for hidden treasures, what happens? Then you'll understand. You see, the promise of this verse is that if you want wisdom, just look for it and you'll find it. How can I be so sure? How can I know that I'll find Jesus? Because Jesus said so. Listen to what he said in John 6:37. Whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. He's waiting for you. He won't turn you away. He won't cast you out. He won't tell you no. Like he's saying, come to me. I'll protect you. I'll deliver you. I'll lead you into the promise of a land that's perfect. He'll make you wise and righteous. He'll protect you from sin. He'll protect you from evil. He'll see to it that you make your way into heaven. Jesus is the wisdom that you need to be a shield that defends you. He is the shield. The question is, will you trust him today? God-given wisdom protects because Jesus protects from the consequence of sin. God-given wisdom delivers because Jesus delivers from the power of sin. And God-given wisdom promises because Jesus promises freedom from the presence of sin. Our action step for today is not to try harder, do more, but to trust in Jesus, to search for him like a hidden treasure. And when we find him, throw ourselves upon him, trusting him as our protector, our deliverer, and the promise keeper of a better place.